Part 382.603 of the PHMSA regulations states that each employer shall ensure that all persons designated to supervise employees receive at least 60 minutes of training on alcohol misuse and an additional 60 minutes of training on drug use. We recommend you exceed these minimum requirements. This second video in this two-video series meets the PHMSA requirements for supervisor reasonable suspicion controlled substances training and will include the physical, behavioral, speech, and performance indicators of probable drug use. Please be sure you have viewed Video 1, Supervisor Reasonable Suspicion Alcohol Training, as a prerequisite to Video 2. Let's quickly review some of the key points covered in Video 1. Supervisors of safety-sensitive employees are required to complete reasonable suspicion training. Supervisors of non-safety sensitive employees and union representatives would also benefit from this training. Reasonable suspicion testing is one of the most important parts of the DOT drug and alcohol testing program. Failure to conduct this type of testing when possible impairment is evident puts workers, as well as the general public, at great risk. The supervisor is the first line of defense in keeping workers and the public safe. For reasonable suspicion alcohol testing, supervisors must be able to make specific, contemporaneous, and articulable observations based on an employee's appearance, behavior, speech, and body odors. These observations will differ slightly when we get into discussing the criteria for reasonable suspicion controlled substances testing, which can include indications of chronic and withdrawal effects. Also in Video 1, you learn the importance of the workbook in this training program, and that you should use the workbook as a reference when making reasonable suspicion observations and determinations, in addition to discussing these lessons with another supervisor. The workbook contains the answers to the what-if scenarios presented at the end of each video. It's important for you to answer the what-if scenarios in both videos, so you're comfortable making reasonable suspicion determinations for alcohol and controlled substances situations. All the necessary forms you will use to document the reasonable suspicion testing process are included in your training package, along with a certificate to signify your completion of supervisor reasonable suspicion training. Let's take a moment to go over some of the general requirements for reasonable suspicion training. All DOT operating agencies require some form of reasonable suspicion training. Although the training requirements are similar for all the operating agencies, the focus of this training is on the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration requirements. The differences between PHMSA requirements and the other DOT operating agency requirements are noted in Appendix A in the workbook. It's important for you to be aware of the training requirements specific to your operating agency, or you may not be in compliance with the DOT regulations. You should view our Guide to the DOT Drug and Alcohol Testing Program training video prior to viewing this training series if you're not already familiar with the PHMSA guidelines for drug and alcohol testing. Now let's review the contents of Video 2. In this video, you will learn why reasonable suspicion testing for controlled substances is so important. How to recognize the physical, behavioral, speech, and performance indicators of probable controlled substances use. How to decide between testing for alcohol, testing for controlled substances, testing for both, or not testing at all. And how reasonable suspicion testing for controlled substances should be conducted. For the purpose of this training, we will refer to controlled substances and drugs interchangeably. The 5 types of drugs an employee can be tested for are marijuana, cocaine, amphetamines, opiates, and phencyclidine or PCP. This training will prepare you for the important role you will play in keeping our roadways safe by conducting reasonable suspicion controlled substances testing when you reasonably suspect that an employee is using drugs. In Section 1, we will discuss why supervisors must test employees for drugs when reasonable suspicion exists. It's important for supervisors to recognize the importance of their decision to conduct reasonable suspicion testing, and the tragic consequences that can occur if a supervisor does not test. You may think you're doing your driver a favor by looking the other way, but you're not. In fact, according to a Drug Use in America study, 30% of tractor-trailer drivers involved in fatal accidents test positive for drugs. And, as published in the National AG Safety Database, in a recent study of nearly 900 truck drivers, drivers stated that at least 1 out of 5 of their fellow truckers regularly drive under the influence of illegal drugs. Even off the road, both employers and employees suffer when drug use exists. Costly results include workplace accidents, injuries, errors, lowered morale, and increased absences. A United States Postal Service study found that employees who test positive in pre-employment drug tests are 66% more likely to be absent and 77% more likely to be discharged within 3 years than those who tested negative. As a supervisor, you're responsible for providing a safe working environment. To do so, you need to watch for and recognize the indicators of probable drug use among your employees. When you have reasonable suspicion that an employee is using drugs, you have to test. Part 382.307 clearly states that an employer shall require a driver to submit to a controlled substances test when the employer has reasonable suspicion to believe that the driver has violated the prohibitions of Subpart B of this part concerning controlled substances. The prohibitions also clearly state that no driver shall report for duty or remain on duty requiring the performance of safety-sensitive functions when the driver uses any controlled substance, except when the use is pursuant to the instructions of a licensed medical practitioner as defined in Part 382.107, who has advised the driver that the substance will not adversely affect the driver's ability to safely operate a commercial motor vehicle. Failure to comply with these regulations can result in a severe penalty, or worse. In Section 2, we will discuss the observations a supervisor needs to make for reasonable suspicion controlled substances testing. These can include the chronic and withdrawal effects of drug use. As defined in the regulations, the employer's determination that reasonable suspicion exists to conduct drug testing must be based on specific, contemporaneous, and articulable observations concerning the appearance, behavior, speech, and body odors of the safety-sensitive employee. The observations may include indications of the chronic and withdrawal effects of controlled substances. The similar criteria for both controlled substances testing and alcohol testing include: specific observations are explicit, meaning clear, stated in detail, such as his eyes are bloodshot or his speech is slurred, or definite, meaning exact or precise, such as he smells like marijuana. I'm not sure, but I think he's acting funny, is not a specific observation. In this case, there is nothing to specifically pinpoint that the employee may be impaired. Contemporaneous means the observations are taking place here and now, not yesterday or last week. He smelled like marijuana the other day is not contemporaneous. He smells like marijuana right now is contemporaneous. A supervisor has to make a reasonable suspicion observation at the time the employee is exhibiting the indicators of possible drug use. Articulable means the supervisor's observations can be put into words. Thinking something just isn't quite right is not articulable. Thinking something just isn't quite right because you see an employee shaking, sweating, and behaving violently is an articulable observation. While some criteria are the same for both controlled substances and alcohol reasonable suspicion testing, some are not. As noted previously, observations leading to a drug test may include indications of chronic and withdrawal effects. Chronic and withdrawal effects cannot be used for making reasonable suspicion alcohol determinations because alcohol is a legal substance and can be used during non-work hours. Drugs are prohibited anytime. So, if there is an indication that an employee has used drugs, the employee is subject to reasonable suspicion controlled substances testing. The chronic effects of drug use show a regular pattern of usage. For example, a persistent cough and yellow fingers can indicate a chronic marijuana user. A persistent runny nose or eczema around the nostrils can indicate a chronic cocaine user. An employee showing increasing paranoia with symptoms similar to schizophrenia is likely to be a habitual amphetamine user. An employee who disappears frequently and exhibits extreme highs and lows in behavior may be a habitual opiate user. Once hooked on opiates, the user must regularly administer the drug to remain functional. Increasing memory and speech problems are likely to be evident in a habitual PCP user. The withdrawal effects of drug use show that a person has used drugs. For example, shaking, sweating, depression, and nausea are indicators that a user needs a fix and is having withdrawals. These effects have been found in users of all the 5 drugs: marijuana, cocaine, amphetamines, opiates, and PCP, yet are more severe for users of amphetamines, opiates, and PCP. As with alcohol testing, short-term indicators must exist for reasonable suspicion drug testing. Short-term indicators relate to an employee's appearance, behavior, speech, and body odors. Common short-term indicators of drug use include impaired mental functions, extreme attitude changes, false confidence, proneness to physical breakdowns and secrecy. Here are short-term indicators for each specific drug broken down into detail. An individual suffering the effects of marijuana is likely to exhibit physical symptoms such as reddened eyes, stained fingertips from holding joints, chronic fatigue, irritating cough, chronic sore throat, accelerated heartbeat, slowed speech, impaired motor coordination, alerted perceptions, and increased appetite. The behavioral symptoms of marijuana use include impaired memory, time and space distortion, feelings of euphoria, panic reactions, paranoia, an "I don't care" attitude, and a false sense of power. An individual suffering the effects of cocaine is likely to exhibit physical symptoms such as dilated pupils, runny or irritated nose, profuse sweating, dry mouth, tremors, needle track marks, loss of appetite, hyperexcitability, restlessness, high blood pressure, heart palpitations, insomnia, and talkativeness. The behavioral symptoms of cocaine use include increased physical activity, depression, isolation and secretive behavior, defensiveness, absences, wide mood swings, difficulty in concentration, paranoia, confusion, and a false sense of power. An individual suffering the effects of opiates is likely to exhibit physical symptoms such as constricted pupils, sweating, nausea and vomiting, diarrhea, needle track marks, loss of appetite, slurred speech, slowed reflexes, depressed breathing and heartbeat, drowsiness and fatigue. The behavioral symptoms of opiate use are mood swings, impaired coordination, depression and apathy, stupor and euphoria. An individual suffering the effects of amphetamines is likely to exhibit physical symptoms such as dilated pupils, sweating, increased blood pressure, palpitations, rapid heartbeat, dizziness, decreased appetite, dry mouth, headaches, blurred vision, insomnia, and high fever. The behavioral symptoms of amphetamine use are confusion, panic, talkativeness, hallucinations, restlessness, anxiety, moodiness, and a false sense of confidence and power. An individual suffering the effects of PCP is likely to exhibit physical symptoms such as dilated or floating pupils, blurred vision, jerky eye movements, drooling, muscle rigidity, profuse sweating, decreased sensitivity to pain, dizziness, drowsiness, impaired physical coordination, severe disorientation and rapid heartbeat. The behavioral symptoms of PCP are anxiety, panic, fear, terror, aggressive or violent behavior, distorted perception, severe confusion and agitation, disorganization, mood swings, poor perceptions of time and distance, poor judgment, and auditory hallucinations. A supervisor does not need to be a drug recognition expert. Therefore, you do not need to determine which drug our employee is impaired by, only that you have reasonable suspicion that the employee is impaired by a drug. While these can't be a basis for a reasonable suspicion determination, long-term indicators can help support a supervisor's decision to test based on short-term indicators. Long-term indicators include quantity and quality of work, refusal to do assigned tasks, increase in errors, reduced quantity of work, inconsistent quality of work, behavior that disrupts the workflow, noticeable changes in written or verbal communication, general job performance issues, general decline in work performance, excessive absences, frequent unexplained disappearances, your growing concern over safety offenses with the employee interfering with or ignoring established procedures, interpersonal work relationships, significant change in relations with coworkers, frequent or intense arguments, intentional avoidance or defiance, expressions of frustrations or discontent, cynical or distrustful of human nature comments, unusual sensitivity to advice or critique of work, personal matters, changes in or unusual topics of conversation, persistently boisterous or rambunctious, makes unreliable or false statements, unrealistic self-appraisals or grandiose statements, temper tantrums or outbursts, secretive, engages in detailed discussions about death, suicide, or harming others, memory problems, persistent excessive fatigue. Remember, you must have short-term indicators for reasonable suspicion testing. In Section 3, we will discuss which indicators cannot be used for the purpose of reasonable suspicion testing. We will also discuss when a supervisor needs to send an employee for an alcohol test, a drug test, both, or neither. No matter how convincing they are, there are some indicators which cannot be used for the purpose of reasonable suspicion testing. As you will remember from the alcohol training video, these indicators include hearsay. For example, so-and-so told me that Joe smokes pot on the job is not grounds for reasonable suspicion controlled substances testing. Rumor. For example, I heard some employees talking about how much pot Joe smokes, also does not constitute grounds for a reasonable suspicion controlled substances test. While a supervisor cannot order a reasonable suspicion test based on hearsay information or rumor because the supervisor is not making the observations firsthand, supervisors can use the information to alert themselves to potential problems. The supervisor, after receiving such information about an employee, should remain on high alert for short-term indicators which can be used as a basis for reasonable suspicion testing. If a supervisor is informed by an employee that another employee appears to be impaired, the supervisor should immediately go and observe the employee in question. As you recall from video 1, a supervisor must send an employee for a reasonable suspicion alcohol test when the supervisor believes an employee is impaired by alcohol. The supervisor's finding must be based on specific, contemporaneous, and articulable observations relating to an employee's appearance, behavior, speech, and body odors. As you recall from the lesson in this video, a supervisor must send an employee for a reasonable suspicion controlled substances test when the supervisor believes an employee has used drugs. The supervisor's findings must be based on specific, contemporaneous, and articulable observations relating to an employee's appearance, behavior, speech, and body odors. Chronic and withdrawal effects are also valid indicators for reasonable suspicion controlled substances testing. You should test for both alcohol and drugs only when you have reasonable suspicion of impairment and the indicators do not discount either alcohol or drugs. You do not need to test at all when an employee is engaging in prohibited conduct. Prohibited conduct is a separate issue from reasonable suspicion. Drug possession is not a prohibition of Part 382, but is listed in Part 392.4 as a prohibition. Witnessed drug use is also a separate prohibition under Parts 382 and Part 392.4. It's not necessary to conduct reasonable suspicion testing for controlled substances when you witness an employee using drugs. Immediately remove the employee from safety-sensitive functions and refer to your employer's policy for consequences of employee drug use in the workplace. Aside from being prohibited conduct under PHMSA regulations, let's not forget that drugs are illegal. In Section 4, we will discuss the 6 steps a supervisor needs to take during the reasonable suspicion controlled substances testing process. We will also discuss the additional steps a supervisor must take to ensure testing is conducted properly. A supervisor needs to be trained. You must also have the appropriate forms, addresses, and telephone numbers on hand, and know where your collection sites are located. Include with this any emergency after-hours site information. Use the collection site information log in the workbook to document the necessary information. Reminder: your findings must be based on specific, contemporaneous, and articulable observations relating to the employee's appearance, behavior, speech, and body odors. These observations can include the chronic and withdrawal effects of drug use. PHMSA regulations only require one supervisor for a reasonable suspicion determination. However, we recommend you substantiate your findings with another trained supervisor. Adding a second supervisor creates greater objectivity and generally strengthens the reliability of a reasonable suspicion determination. It's important to note that some operating agencies require 2 supervisors for making a reasonable suspicion determination. Please refer to Appendix A in the workbook to find out which ones. You must document the observations leading to the reasonable suspicion controlled substances test. Using the reasonable suspicion recording form included, record only the facts and not your interpretation of the facts. The documentation should be detailed, specific, and factual. Documentation must be completed within 24 hours of the observed behavior or before the test results are released, whichever comes first. We recommend you complete the documentation as soon as possible so you don't forget any important details. Keep in mind, you may be asked to explain your actions at a later date. Don't, however, delay the testing in order to complete documentation. Documentation must be kept in your employer's confidential drug and alcohol testing files. Employers must maintain all documentation generated in connection with decisions to administer reasonable suspicion controlled substances tests. When you confront an employee whom you suspect of having used drugs, do not accuse the employee of being a druggie. Let the employee know that you want to make sure the employee is fit for duty. You must also protect the employee's privacy. Take the employee to a private and confidential area and base the confrontation solely on the documentation you have compiled. Do not attempt to get a confession, but document one if it's offered. When you confront an employee based on your reasonable suspicion findings, you should expect anger, denial, excuses, apologies, promises, self-pity, and tears. You should not let these reactions change your mind. No matter how sorry the employee is still a risk to him or herself, coworkers, and the public at large. You'll need to call the collection site ahead of time to ensure a collector is on hand. If a collector is not available, you'll need to look for another site. Arrange transportation both to and from the collection site. Consider disciplinary action if the employee refuses transport, or call the police if you feel the employee poses a danger to others. There is no time limit for reasonable suspicion controlled substances testing defined under Part 382.307. Therefore, you should continue your efforts until you are able to complete the testing process. In the event a test comes back negative, but you still feel there's something wrong with the employee, you may decide to send the employee for a medical evaluation. Some cases have been reported in which a driver was exhibiting symptoms similar to those of drug use, and the symptoms were later determined to be those of a serious medical condition. When conducting reasonable suspicion testing, supervisors should always ask themselves, 1. Am I being objective? Are my findings based on specific, contemporaneous, and articulable observations? 2. Would my decision be less responsible if I did not send the employee for a reasonable suspicion controlled substances test? And 3. Would another supervisor agree with my decision? If you can answer yes to all 3 questions, then you should proceed with the testing process. Unlike for alcohol testing, the regulations do not address removal from duty pending the result of a reasonable suspicion controlled substances test. If you feel the employee poses a danger to others and/or him or herself, we recommend removing the individual from safety-sensitive functions until a test result becomes available. However, if no contemporaneous indicators are present, you can return the employee to safety-sensitive functions. The decision to return an employee to duty pending test results is at the employer's discretion. Let's take a moment to review what we covered in sections 1 through 4. In section 1, you learned why reasonable suspicion testing for controlled substances is so important and the tragic consequences that can result if supervisors don't test employees whom they reasonably suspect of using drugs. In section 2, you learned about the short-term and long-term indicators of controlled substances use. You also learned about the chronic and withdrawal effects of controlled substances. In section 3, you learned when to test for alcohol and when to test for controlled substances. You also learned that hearsay and rumor information cannot be used for the purpose of reasonable suspicion testing, and that prohibited conduct is a separate issue from reasonable suspicion and has separate consequences. Finally, in section 4, we reviewed the 6 steps in the reasonable suspicion testing process as they relate to controlled substances testing. The steps are: prepare, observe, confirm, document, confront, and conduct. Please take a few minutes to use the knowledge you have gained in this training and think about the following scenarios. Turn to the What If Scenarios from Video 2 section of the workbook now. For each scenario, you'll find space to write in your own determination on how to handle the situation for each of the 6 steps of reasonable suspicion. This will also give you additional information to use as a reference later. Stop the tape and complete your answer. Discuss the situation with other supervisors who may be completing this training with you. Then, restart the video to check the answer and see how you did. Stop the tape now and fill in your answer for each of the 6 steps in the workbook. When you think your answer is complete, restart the video to see how you did. Scenario 1. What would you do? Kevin is slurring his words, but only slightly. You think he's staggering a little too. You smell a faint alcohol-like odor, but you're not sure if it's his new aftershave. Kevin is a new employee, so you don't know him very well. You know he has worn aftershave in the past because you saw him put it on to freshen up after a long haul. What would you do? Answer 1. In this scenario, you have made all the necessary observations for reasonable suspicion alcohol testing. Specific: slurring his words, staggering, alcohol-like odor. Contemporaneous: you have made observations right now. Articulable: you can put your observations into words. He was slurring his words, staggering, and had a faint alcohol-like odor. These observations are based on the individual's appearance, behavior, speech, and body odors. Remember, as long as you have made the appropriate observations, you can conduct reasonable suspicion testing. Please refer now to the standard procedures listed before the what-if scenarios in the workbook to see if you properly followed them in this scenario. Scenario 2. You've heard rumors that Paul uses drugs. You also saw some graffiti on the bathroom wall of the men's room that read, "Paul smokes dope. Paul wears tie-dyed shirts and listens to the Grateful Dead." You have been keeping an eye on Paul, but have not noticed anything to suggest he uses drugs. Lance, another one of your drivers, finds a joint on the floor of the truck Paul was driving. Paul says the joint is not his. What would you do? Answer 2. In this scenario, since you are not observing anything to show that Paul is impaired, you cannot conduct reasonable suspicion testing. The information you received is considered rumor or hearsay, which cannot be used for the purpose of reasonable suspicion testing. Even though you have actual drugs in hand, there is nothing to prove to whom they belong. Even if you observed Paul in possession of the joint, that still wouldn't constitute grounds for reasonable suspicion testing. Remember, possession and use are separate prohibitions under PHMSA regulations. In this scenario, you should document the information, as you would long-term indicators, to support any future decisions to test. Documenting rumor and hearsay information can help back up your decision when you do test, when short-term indicators are in place, and will provide a record of the situations leading to the reasonable suspicion test. Please refer now to the standard procedures listed before the what-if scenarios in the workbook to see if you properly followed the document step in this scenario. Scenario 3. George is generally very quiet. When he speaks, he tends to be soft-spoken. Some of the other drivers pick on him for being so soft-spoken. They call him a wallflower. Today, George is extremely talkative. He is also speaking very quickly and loudly. He's acting paranoid. Every time you walk by, he says he's not doing anything wrong, even though you haven't asked. You think he may be using drugs. What would you do? Answer 3. In this scenario, you reasonably suspect George is using drugs and have made all the necessary observations for reasonable suspicion drug testing. Specific: speaking loudly, acting paranoid. Contemporaneous: you have made the observations right now. Articulable: you can put your observations into words. He is not acting like himself. He is speaking loudly and acting paranoid. These observations are based on the individual's appearance, behavior, speech, and body odors. Please refer now to the standard procedures listed before the what-if scenarios in the workbook to see if you properly followed them in this scenario. Scenario 4. Todd has long hair and dresses, as you say, like a bum. Todd has a bad attitude. Every time you ask him to do something, he gives you flack. You don't really like Todd. You notice that Todd appears to be losing weight, and his behavior seems to be getting more erratic. He wears long sleeves even on hot days, and you've heard him say, "Heroin is cool." What would you do? Answer 4. In this scenario, you are observing long-term indicators of probable drug use. Although you cannot use these observations as a basis for reasonable suspicion testing, you can document the observations to support any future decisions to test. Document your observations and keep the documentation on hand in the event you conduct a reasonable suspicion test in the future. This documentation will support your decision and provide a record of the events leading to the test. Please refer now to the standard procedures listed before the what-if scenarios in the workbook to see if you properly followed the document step in this scenario. Scenario 5. Alan seemed fine when he clocked in for duty this morning. Now he's sweating, shaking, and complaining of nausea. Alan has not been out of your sight the entire time. You're not sure if he's sick with a cold or the flu. You have documented Alan behaving strangely in the past and have suspected he may be using drugs. Alan is preparing for a long drive from Hartford, Connecticut to Miami, Florida. What would you do? Answer 5. Alan is quite possibly exhibiting the chronic and withdrawal effects of drugs. Although chronic and withdrawal effects cannot be used for reasonable suspicion alcohol testing, chronic and withdrawal effects can be used for reasonable suspicion controlled substances testing. If you believe Alan is exhibiting the chronic and withdrawal effects of drugs, you should immediately remove him from performing safety-sensitive functions and conduct reasonable suspicion controlled substances testing. Please refer now to the standard procedures listed before the what-if scenarios in the workbook to see if you properly followed them in this scenario. Scenario 6. In addition to driving, Mark performs other safety-sensitive functions on a daily basis. He's in charge of the maintenance of all your logging trucks. He's also in charge of inspecting the fuel lines in your fill-up area. Mark is on duty, but you have yet to assign him a task. Mark is exhibiting signs of probable drug use, shaking hands, dry mouth, and bloodshot eyes. You believe if you do assign him to a safety-sensitive task, he may injure himself or others. Since he is not actually performing safety-sensitive functions yet, what would you do? Answer 6. Unlike the criteria for reasonable suspicion alcohol testing, a driver does not need to be performing safety-sensitive functions to be subject to a reasonable suspicion drug test. If you believe Mark is using drugs and have made the necessary observations, specific, contemporaneous, and articulable based on the individual's appearance, behavior, speech, and body odors, you should immediately take him for a test. Please refer now to the standard procedures listed before the what-if scenarios in the workbook to see if you properly follow them in this scenario. Scenario 7. You can't locate 3 of your drivers. You look around for a while and then notice the door to the maintenance shed is slightly ajar. You walk over to close it. When you get there, you find the 3 drivers inside. You enter the maintenance shed. It's full of smoke. You believe the smoke is marijuana smoke. You see a lit joint on the floor. Each driver claims the other drivers were smoking the joint and not him. What would you do? Answer 7. This scenario is probably one of the toughest you can face, and the answer isn't black and white. As you recall, drug use is a separate prohibition from reasonable suspicion, which addresses probable use. You didn't actually see the driver smoking the joint, so this scenario doesn't qualify as a use case. See glossary for actual knowledge definition. Next, does room odor qualify as body odor? This is again pushing the envelope on what observations and indicators can be used for reasonable suspicion testing. Chances are that if you walk into a room full of pot odor, the people in the room were most likely smoking pot. What you could do in this scenario is take each driver outside the shed and see if the drivers individually smell like pot. If so, it's a specific, contemporaneous, and articulable observation, and you could then conduct reasonable suspicion controlled substances testing. Also, look for other indicators such as bloodshot eyes and paranoia. If either exist, they are viable indicators of probable drug use for reasonable suspicion testing. If you reasonably suspect the drivers of using drugs and have made observations as we have noted, conduct reasonable suspicion controlled substances testing. Refer now to the standard procedures listed before the what-if scenarios in the workbook to see if you properly follow them in this scenario. Scenario 8. Darren was exhibiting all the indicators of probable drug use: shaking, erratic, and violent behavior. You have completed all the initial steps for reasonable suspicion testing and have informed him that you will be taking him for a drug test. Darren says he won't go. Darren gets into his car. You try to stop him, but he insists on driving. What would you do? Answer 8. Inform Darren of the penalties for a refusal to test, see glossary, and do everything in your power to prevent him from driving. Threaten him with disciplinary action or threaten to call the police. If he drives away, report his plate number and the make and model of his car to your local police and alert them to the situation. If he agrees to testing, follow the step to conduct. Please refer now to the standard procedures listed before the what-if scenarios in the workbook to see if you properly followed the conduct step in this scenario. Scenario 9. You just completed reasonable suspicion training. You feel comfortable with what you learned and feel that you know what indicators to look for. You've signed the certificate of completion that was included in this training package and have given it to your employer to retain. You sit at your desk and observe the drivers on duty. Currently, none of your drivers are exhibiting indicators of impairment. What would you do? Answer 9. In this scenario, you should use the time to prepare in the event one of your drivers does exhibit signs of possible impairment. Use the collection site information log in the workbook to record the names, addresses, telephone numbers, and after-hours information of the collection and testing sites your employers use for drug and alcohol testing. Also document your DER's emergency contact information. Review the information in this workbook so you are confident and know what to do. Taking the time to do this before a situation occurs will save you valuable time if an employee does become impaired. If that happens, you want to worry about getting the employee to the site and away from safety-sensitive duties, not be scrambling to complete paperwork, looking for information, or finding a place to conduct testing. Please refer now to the standard procedures listed before the what-if scenarios in the workbook to see if you properly followed the prepare step in this scenario. This now concludes the video portion of this training. Please complete Part 1 of the workbook to meet the remaining portion of the 60-minute time requirement for reasonable suspicion controlled substances training.